Talk forensics with Pastor Dan, Dr. Dave, sorry. We're going to begin the actual looking at the concepts of forensics. So let's pull this up here. Here we go. And we're going to start with the definition of forensics. Now, we're going to have a couple definitions. They can be relatively similar, but a couple times they'll be slightly different so we can get different perspectives. Definition for the first one of forensics is, pull it down, process of uncovering of evidence that stands as fact. It uses science to help in legal matters such as crimes. So we're going to identify evidence and use science to help us understand which of those facts are true. Now, we're going to start to look at the history, the timeline of major forensics. This is not all the forensics history that exists, but these are the 10 most important scientific discoveries that were made. So we're going to start with the year 1814. The year 1814, a man named Mateo Orfilio, he was Spanish. He was referred to as the father of toxicology, the first began to look at poisons or toxins in the body as a way of identifying process of death. Second major event took place in 1879. The man's name was Alfonso Bertillon. He worked with something called anthropometry. That's body measurements. Those are kind of thing like if you take your length of your arm from fingertip to fingertip, that's approximately equal to your height. If you take your head and wrap it 3 times, I believe that's roughly equivalent to your waist size. So those kinds of things, those body measurements were used. So if we didn't have a complete body, that we could in some way identify height and things along those lines. The femur, if you have the femur bone, you can identify the height because it's always consistent. Once you know the femur, you know how tall somebody actually is. All right. Third is a gentleman named Francis Galton. He's English, and he's the first one to begin to do fingerprinting. We're going to do an entire section on fingerprinting, the different types there are, how many points are necessary. But Francis Galton, Sir Francis Galton, was the first to look at fingerprints and identify it, and that was in the year 1892. Now, the fourth major discovery took place in the year 1893, a year later, and the man's name was Hans Gross. Hans was an Austrian, yes, and he was the first to begin an actual procedure, a process for crimes investigation. Before this, it was hodgepodge. The idea of like quarrying off a scene, none of that was, and that's part of the reason why, like the Jack the Ripper case was so easy for him to get away with it, because they didn't have any kind of consistency. The reporters of the time completely walked through the scene, so you couldn't tell what was the Ripper's footprints and which were reporters. So it was actually Gross who began to identify that process. Now we have 2 in the same year. Both of the following are the year 1910. So we're getting into the 20th century here. The first one is a man named Albert Osborne. Now, Osborne is an American, and he is the first to do what's called QDE, questionable document examination or document examination. So like counterfeits and forgeries, all those kinds of things, that was the work of Albert Osborne, not Ozzy, sorry. That same year, a really big person in the field of forensics was a name named Edmond Lecourt. He was a Frenchman, ooh la la. So he was the first to design a crime lab. Now, we will talk about that more specifically, and there's a principle associated with Lecourt that helps us understand trace evidence. All right, seventh main event takes place is the year 1915, and the man's name was Leon Latte. He was the Italians, Gumba Capazano. All right. He was the first to do blood grouping tests. So the idea of different blood types, that was the first to take place in 1915. And then we're getting closer to present time. We're now at 1925. 1925, another male American, a man named Calvin Goddard. Now, Calvin Goddard did firearms and bullet comparison tests. So the grooves and lands that we know, the idea of ballistics, all that is Goddard. Goddard also had a huge emphasis on rocketry. So that's the reason why one of the major propulsion labs in Cleveland, Ohio, is called the Goddard. There's another name with it too, but the Goddard Lab, because he did a lot with rocketry. All right, now we're moving into the 1975. So I am now alive at this point. 1975, this man named Walter McCrone. He's another American, and McCrone is the first to begin to use microscopes to incorporate into forensic investigation. So like hair analysis, to see the different, oh shoot, I can't think of it right now, the lines that's inside the center of it. Also using that for firearms and the comparisons. So begin to actually use microscopes in forensic, that's the work of Walter McCrone. And the last one, the big one, the largest one, was in 1984. I remember this one because it was a really big event, and it dealt with Sir Alec Jeffreys, another British, and he did DNA profiling in terms of forensic. Now, Jeffreys didn't discover DNA but he's the first to apply it to forensics as a way of investigation. And then from there, DNA just totally exploded. So those are the 10 important timelines. We also have 4 important cases. Now, these cases are important because they directed how evidence can be taken into a crime. The first one is called Fry versus U.S. Now, in this case, let's not let me delete that. Let's go over here. Delete, there we go. In this, the admissibility must be generally accepted. What does that mean? Well, here's the situation. There was a man named James Fry. He was convicted of second-degree murder. Now, during the case, there was what they call the deception test. We now call a lie detector. The lie detector basically identified that he was according to the machine, telling the truth that he didn't kill the person. But the conviction that the new deception test had not been admitted, and because it was not generally accepted, that became the standard. Whether or not it can be allowed had to be considered generally accepted. All right, he eventually was released from prison after serving so many years for second-degree murder. There are 3 or 4 degrees of murder. First is premeditated, second is passion, and third is like manslaughter or self-defense. And the fourth, I don't want to go over it now. All right, so that's the first case, Fry versus U.S. Second case, Daubert versus Merrill Dowell Pharmaceutical. Now, this is going to be a civil case. It's not a legal federal case, but it did go all the way to Supreme Court. What happened here is the identification that the judge would now be identified as the gatekeeper of evidence. The judge would be the one who can say whether or not it would be allowed. It didn't matter if it was accepted or not. If you could convince a judge that it should be allowed, then it could be let in. Now, in order to do that, though, there were certain prerequisites. First of all, the technique or theory had to be able to be tested. Okay, there had to be a way of identifying it. Second, there had to be a peer review of the technique or theory. In other words, it had to have a lot of people agreeing that it was an effective method. Third, the technique's potential for error had to be identified. So therefore, they could also be brought up in that way. And then finally, there's one more down. There's a standard for controlling the techniques. In other words, it's consistent. It doesn't change all the time. And then lastly, the process that attracted the widespread acceptance in relevant scientific. So there had to be some level of acceptance. And if these 5 parameters meant, then the judge could allow new techniques. Now, the actual case here, the Dauberts were a family whose children had birth defects. And they believed that some medication that Merrill Dowell Pharmaceutical had allowed on the market was the reason for those defects. They claimed the drug caused the defects. Eventually, after it went to the Supreme Court and these were allowed in, they won their case. All right, third case. Now another civil case. It's Como Tire Limited versus Carmichael. Carmichael had a tire that blew out on him, and he wanted to sue the tire company. The big issue here was the presence of a expert witness. Now, from now on, then after this case, the gatekeeper role of judge would also include expert testimony. So whether or not to be allowed in would be up to the judge. Case here involved a man named Patrick Carmichael, owned a vehicle with tires purchased by Como Tires. There was a blowout. His expert wished to show the tires were defective. Now, what happens today, a lot of times, if we allow one expert, you'll end up with the dual battle of expert witnesses. One will say this way, and they'll say the opposite way. And so it comes down to is who does a jury believe most? But that took place after that Como Tire verdict. All right, last one up there is Compiano versus State. Now, in this case, gives more flexibility in introducing new techniques or theories. Now, here's what happened. Carl Compiano was an anesthesiologist whose wife and ex-lover were found dead. It originally was considered natural causes, but a lot of people believe so. After years of getting by, they exhumed the body. Now, Compiano believed that the exhumation process was illegal and not allowed because of the fact the judge had allowed it. He took it all the way to the Supreme Court. He was convicted of capital murder, it means death penalty, on the basis of the injection of a drug. On appeal, argued that the judge had abused his power. The Supreme Court decided that new techniques such as exhumation of the bodies would now be allowed, and that changed how we do court cases. All right, very good. So those are our 4 cases. Those aren't the only cases, but those are ones that really move forward the level of understanding. Now, the last thing we're going to do today, and we're going to do a project for 2 days afterwards, where you're going to design your own crime lab. Okay, I'm going to give you 2 days to design it, and you can present it to somebody. However you want to do it. You want to do a poster, you want to do a PowerPoint, you want to do a song. I don't care how. Here, you're going to have to convince a town people that you need services of a lab. The first service you need, these are basic. These need to be in there no matter what, because these are considered the bare minimum. The first is called the physical science units. What are we talking about here? We're talking trace analysis, so like hair, material, fibers, stuff like that. Chemistry involved with it, so like identifying what chemical compounds are fine. Physics, if there's like an accident, things along those lines, that's the minimum, the physical science. Then we have what is referred to as the biology unit. This is the body, so anything involving blood or hair or having to do with DNA, all of that, it takes place in the biology unit. The third one is a document examination, what we refer to often as a questionable documents. So like, is the handwriting right? We will do all of that stuff in class eventually too. Handwriting analysis, identifying forgeries, things along those lines. That's 3, we've got 2 more to go. Fourth one is firearms. Oh, that's a cool one. We're talking ballistics. So striations in the bullet doesn't match up. The shell casings, the pin mark, things along those lines, all those identify the ballistics. And the last one there is a photo units. This one we'll talk about later on. Photos are incredibly important because we helps us to remember what happened long after the crime is over. I'm going to tell a story now. There was a professor I had come to the science club one time. He was an FBI agent, and one of his students at the college had asked him to investigate a crime, what he thought was a crime, because his brother had apparently gotten drunk, crawled out onto a dirt road, and was run over by a truck. And the kid said, my brother never drank. That's just not who he is. Can you look into the case? So he went to the police department and he asked to see the photo. When he saw the photo, he immediately said this was murder. And they were flabbergasted. What do you mean? Well, he said the photo showed that there was no mud on the feet. If he was drunk, if he had stumbled out during a rainstorm, which it was that night, he should have had mud on his feet. When it turns out, when they actually did a more proper investigation, the kid had talked to the wrong girlfriend, and the boyfriend and the friends beat the snot out of him. And when that happened, they killed him. They didn't want to get caught, so they dragged the body into the road, a dark road. Some older woman driving a truck drove over the body, and she thought she had killed him. And so that's why photos are really important. All right. Now, those are the required services. These are additional services. There'll be at least 2 or 3 that you should include from this. They're not required, but they're good to include. First is called toxicology. Now, toxicology sometimes will be outsourced. So, like if a local crime lab, I'm in Pennsylvania, they can't afford a toxicology, they'll send it to Harrisburg to the state crime lab, or they'll do testing for drugs and poisons and things along those lines. All right. Second is latent fingerprints. So, fingerprints you can see, those are called visible fingerprints. Latent fingerprints are ones that you can't see left behind because of oils and stains, and we'll talk about all that as well. Third one is voice analysis. In other words, does this match up? Even AI sounds an awful lot like people, but if you run it through a voice analysis, it will not be exactly the same as the person themselves. And then a polygraph, a lie detector. Lie detectors don't actually tell if you're telling the truth. They just identify the possibility of deception. And a lot of times if a person is really stressed out and nervous, they can mess themselves up. So that's something. And the last one here is called a crime scene investigative unit. In other words, this is a unit that goes in and gets the evidence and walks it all the way through, making sure that they don't miss any piece of information. So they would make sure they go through all the different parts and make sure that all categorized and tested properly. Okay, so those are additional. These last ones are called optional services. Those are like really high tech. Only the best of the best crime labs have these. All right, so the first one is called a forensic psychologist. So this is like Criminal Minds. These are profilers, identifying if somebody, the nature of crime, who they are, their background, maybe they have some deep-seated hatred of some group of people or maybe a woman, those kinds of things. That's what a forensic psychologist done. The next one is hard to say. It's a forensic odontist. That's a dentist, okay? A forensic dentist, like bite impressions, things along those lines. That's what a forensic odontist does. Third is called a forensic engineer. I really have a great deal of appreciation for this one. My son, when he was just beginning to drive, went to go pick up a friend of his, and as he drove, he rear-ended the guy. And my thoughts, okay, he rear-ended, it's my son's fault. The state trooper who showed up the scene looked at the scene, had some background in forensic engineering, and immediately knew that the guy had swerved all the way over in front of my son. There was nothing he could do, and stopped. And the reason why he'd done that was because the guy was drunk. He was a DUI. And so that helped my son not to get points on his license. So that was something that was really important to me. And effectively, those kinds of things involving like stopping distance and skid marks and all that is forensic engineering. Okay, and the last one is forensic computer and digital analysis. So identifying computer files and recovering of information, things along those lines. And I think, if I'm correct, that is the end of today's notes. So hopefully that wasn't too bad. We're going to stop from there, and we're going to pick up a continuation. We're going to take 2 days to do the crime lab. We'll talk about that. And then after that, we'll do another day of notes, and then we'll do a lab with that. So we're going from there. Take care. God bless. Bye.